Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging straight into criminal law, specifically focusing on this really critical line. It separates a completely justified act from one that's, well, only partially excused.
Right.
And in homicide cases, this distinction is huge. I mean, it's the difference between walking free and potentially a long prison sentence. So our mission today is to really get under the hood of the legal mechanism that can drop a charge from murder down to voluntary manslaughter.
Yeah.
And the core idea for you to hold on to is this. It's much more about the defendant's mental state, what the law calls malice, than the physical act itself.
That's absolutely spot on. That insight that the mental state can kind of override the objective facts in terms of culpability, that's really the foundation for our whole discussion today. So to figure out how this intent or lack of it changes things, we first need to set the baseline. What does perfect self-defense look like? You know, the situation where the law says, okay, you did nothing legally wrong, full acquittal.
Yeah.
Then we'll dissect this other doctrine, imperfect self-defense. It's powerful, but it's not a full defense. It deals with those really difficult cases of honest but tragically mistaken fear. And finally, we'll look at how this whole framework played out in a really important Maryland case, State v. Faulkner.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting with that best case scenario you mentioned, what exactly does someone need to show to claim perfect self-defense? The kind that gets you a complete acquittal makes the killing lawful.
Okay, so perfect self-defense, or PSD, that's the general rule for justification. If you meet all the requirements, the killing is deemed lawful. It's simply not a crime. And to get there, you need to satisfy 4 specific elements. All 4.
Okay, lay out the first one for us. What's that objective standard?
First element. The accused must have had reasonable grounds to believe they were in apparent, imminent, or immediate danger of death or serious bodily harm. This is the objective part we ask. Would a reasonable person in exactly the same situation have felt that same level of threat?
So, the reasonable person test. If the facts suggest anyone would likely panic, you pass that one. What about the person's actual state of mind?
That's element number 2. The accused must have in fact believed they were in this danger. This is purely subjective. Did this specific person genuinely believe it? You know, a manufactured excuse after the fact just won't cut it. They must have actually been terrified in that moment.
Right, so even if the situation looked dangerous objectively, if you personally didn't feel threatened but acted anyway, that's not self-defense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. What are the last 2 hurdles?
Third, you can't have started the fight. The person claiming self-defense can't have been the aggressor or, provoked the whole conflict. And finally, number 4, the force used has to be reasonable and not excessive. It needs to be proportional to the threat faced. Like you said earlier, you can't shoot someone just because they slapped you.
Okay, that is a high bar. Objective reality. Your own subjective fear, you weren't the aggressor, and you used proportional force. Got it. So what happens then when that subjective part is there, the person genuinely, honestly believes they're in mortal danger, but the objective part fails. They were truly terrified, but a reasonable person wouldn't have been. They were tragically wrong about the threat.
Now that specific gap is exactly where imperfect self-defense, or ISD, comes into play. And it's crucial to understand ISD is not a complete defense like PSD. It doesn't get you acquitted. Its function is very specific. It operates solely to negate malice. Malice is that particular mental state, that intent the prosecution needs to prove for a murder conviction. So if ISD applies successfully, you don't walk free. But the charge gets mitigated, knocked down from murder to voluntary manslaughter, and the core requirement is basically just that, a subjective, honest belief by the killer that their actions were necessary for their safety. Even though, looking at it objectively, a reasonable person wouldn't agree. They wouldn't have found force necessary in that situation.
Okay, this is where the legal theory hits the pavement, right? Let's dig into the case that really solidified this doctrine in Maryland. State v. Melvin Faulkner. What actually happened that night? Give us the essential facts the court had to work with.
Yeah, the facts are pretty stark. Melvin Faulkner Jr. was arguing with a guy named Jimmy Emanuel outside a bar in Baltimore. It escalated, turned into a physical fight. Faulkner pulled out a handgun. Now, he testified he did this because he believed Jimmy Emanuel had a knife. Whether there actually was a knife was a key point of conflicting testimony later. But here's the tragedy. Faulkner ended up shooting Ricky Emanuel twice in the chest. Ricky was Jimmy's brother.
Wait, he shot the brother?
Yeah, and Ricky wasn't even really involved in the fight itself. Testimony suggested he was actually trying to push his brother Jimmy out of the line of fire when he was shot.
Wow.
Faulkner was ultimately charged with assault with intent to murder Ricky.
Okay, shooting the person trying to break it up? That complicates things massively. Sounds like transferred intent might even be in the mix. So what was the big legal gap or question the Court of Appeals had to address here?
Well, the legal issue was really twofold. First, fundamentally, does Maryland law even recognize this mitigation defense of imperfect self-defense? Was it a valid legal concept in the state? And second, if it does exist, does it apply to a charge like assault with intent to murder? Because that's not actually homicide, right? Does ISD mitigate that specific charge too?
Fascinating. So the state was basically arguing this defense shouldn't even exist, let alone apply here.
Mhm.
What rule did the court land on to justify this sort of middle ground of mitigation instead of full acquittal?
The court formally adopted the rule that, look, if a defendant commits a homicide while honestly believing they need to use deadly force for protection, even if that belief is unreasonable, they simply do not possess the required mental element of malice. And if malice is absent, they can't be guilty of murder. It's logically impossible under the definition of murder. This rule really breaks down into two core elements for analysis. First, there's the subjective honest belief. Did the defendant genuinely honestly believe that using force was necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily harm? And second, the objective unreasonableness. Would a reasonable person looking at the same situation not have concluded that such actions were necessary?
Okay, thank you. That lays out the test clearly. Now, for the court's step-by-step application in Faulkner's case, let's use that Fire Act structure. We've got the facts and the issue. You just gave us the rule. Now, the analysis. How did the court apply that first element of subjective honest belief to Faulkner's actions and his testimony?
Well, the court pointed directly to Faulkner's testimony. He explicitly said on the stand that he believed Jimmy Emanuel had a knife and that he genuinely thought pulling his gun and using it was necessary for his own safety at that moment. Now, crucially, the appeals court didn't have to decide if Faulkner was actually telling the truth about the knife or his fear. That's not their job. They just needed to determine if his testimony was sufficient to create what's called a jury issue on that subjective element. Was there enough evidence that a jury could reasonably find he was honestly, even if mistakenly, fearful? And they concluded, yes, there was.
Understood. So enough evidence to let the jury decide if he was genuinely scared.
Yeah.
Now, what about the second element, the objective unreasonableness? How did the court figure out that Faulkner's belief, assuming it was honest, was objectively not reasonable?
The court basically reasoned backwards from the trial court's decision on perfect self-defense. The trial judge had refused to give the jury an instruction on perfect self-defense.
Ah,
That refusal likely happened because the objective evidence was shaky. Maybe there was conflicting testimony about who started the fight, or maybe there was doubt about whether Jimmy Emanuel actually had a knife. The facts didn't clearly support the reasonable person standard for PSD, so because the trial court implicitly found that the killing was objectively without justification or excuse, meaning the PSD standard failed, that very failure established the necessary objective unreasonableness needed to then consider imperfect self-defense.
that makes perfect sense. The failure of the perfect defense opens the door to analyzing the imperfect one. But let's circle back to that charge assault with intent to murder. Why does this homicide mitigation defense, ISD, apply when Faulkner wasn't even charged with killing Ricky?
That's a really key point the court addressed. They reasoned that ISD applies whenever malice is a required element of the crime charged. Assault with intent to murder isn't just any assault, it's a specific intent crime. It requires proving the defendant intended to commit an unlawful murder.
Ah, okay. The intent element is key.
Exactly. So, since ISD works by negating the malice required for murder, it must also negate the specific intent to murder element required for that particular assault charge. Therefore, the court concluded, if ISD applies, it mitigates the assault with intent to murder charge down to something akin to an attempted voluntary manslaughter, or maybe just aggravated assault, depending on the jurisdiction's statutes. The malice isn't there.
Got it. That connects the dots. Now, why did the state push back so hard against recognizing ISD? What were their policy arguments? Surely they argued against letting someone off easier for being unreasonable.
They definitely did. The state raised two main arguments. First, they tried to argue that ISD should only be allowed in really rare cases, what they called extreme extenuating circumstances. The court shot that down pretty quickly, saying, well, what does extreme even mean? It's too vague. They held the defense applies whenever the objective test for self-defense fails, but the subjective belief was still honestly held. No need for extreme circumstances.
Okay, so that was one argument. What about the more direct one that ISD essentially rewards unreasonableness? That seems like a stronger point.
It does seem intuitive, but the court strongly rejected that claim, too. They made a couple of points. First, they emphasized that, generally speaking, criminal law is based on the offender's mental state. Culpability, your level of blameworthiness, hinges heavily on your intent. Second, they pointed out that ISD provides, in their words, little reward for unreasonableness. Why? Because you're still getting convicted of a serious felony voluntary manslaughter or a similarly mitigated charge. You're not getting acquitted. So it still holds the unreasonable actor accountable just for a crime that better reflects their actual, albeit flawed, mental state, one driven by fear, not malice.
Okay, so the court wasn't buying the rewarding bad judgment argument. After analyzing all that, the rule, the elements, the policy, what was the court's final conclusion from Melvin Faulkner?
The court concluded definitively that, yes, imperfect self-defense is a recognized mitigation defense in Maryland. And they found that Faulkner had produced enough evidence of his subjectively honest, even if objectively unreasonable belief to warrant an ISD instruction to the jury. Therefore, the trial court made a legal error by refusing to give that instruction. Faulkner's conviction for assault with intent to murder had to be reversed, and the case sent back, likely for a new trial where the jury would be instructed on ISD.
Right, a clear win for the defense on appeal, establishing ISD firmly. Okay, to really cement this difference between objective facts and subjective belief, let's try a hypothetical. Make it visceral, something you can really picture. Imagine this. You're walking through your house late at night, total darkness. Suddenly, you hear a loud crash downstairs. Your heart pounds. You grab, say, a baseball bat. You creep downstairs and you see a figure standing totally motionless in the shadows. They're holding something dark and long, and it looks exactly like a rifle pointed right at you. In that split second of terror, you swing the bat hard, seriously injuring the person. Only then, the lights flick on and you see. It was your roommate, standing there frozen in fear, holding nothing but a mop handle. How does imperfect self-defense play out here?
Oh, that's a fantastic and chilling illustration. It's almost a textbook ISD scenario because it perfectly splits the objective and subjective elements. Your subjective honest belief is incredibly strong, right? In the dark, seeing that shape, hearing the crash. You genuinely believed you were facing an immediate lethal threat. You saw a rifle. But the objective unreasonableness is equally stark. Objectively, it was just a mop. Your roommate was motionless, maybe even frozen in fear themselves. A reasonable person, if they could have seen clearly, would not have perceived a lethal threat requiring that level of force. So because your action, swinging the bat, was driven by that honest but objectively unreasonable fear, the malice element, the intent to commit an unlawful, unjustified battery or homicide, is negated. You wouldn't be acquitted under perfect self-defense because, objectively, the force wasn't necessary. But your culpability would be mitigated. If you had killed them, it would likely be voluntary manslaughter, not murder. Since you injured them, it would be a mitigated assault charge, not assault with intent to murder or cause grievous bodily harm with malice. Your genuine fear, however mistaken, reduces your blameworthiness.
That really drives home how powerful that subjective belief can be, even when tragically wrong. Okay, let's synthesize all this. For someone listening, maybe a law student facing an exam, or just anyone trying to understand legal responsibility with the actionable step-by-step diagnostic checklist, how should you approach analyzing any self-defense claim?
Absolutely. Having a clear framework is key. Here's a diagnostic checklist, nesting the analysis logically. Step 1, issue spotting. First, just identify the situation. Is there a homicide, or maybe an assault, where the defendant is claiming they acted in self-defense? That's your trigger. Step 2, test for complete exoneration, perfect self-defense. Immediately analyze all 4 elements of PSD together. Did the defendant have objectively reasonable grounds for fear? Did they subjectively believe it? Were they the aggressor? Was the force proportional? If the answer is yes to all 4, analysis stops. It's full acquittal. Step 3, the pivot point. Okay, what if the analysis fails? Crucially, if it fails only on the objective reasonableness element, meaning the grounds for fear weren't objectively reasonable, but the other elements might still be met of us, you immediately pivot. You now must consider imperfect self-defense. Step 4, the ISD check. Now you ask the core ISD question. Despite the objective unreasonableness, was the defendant's belief in the necessity of using force still subjectively honest? Was it a genuine, albeit mistaken belief? If yes, then malice is negated. The defendant is still culpable, but the charge is mitigated, typically murder down to voluntary manslaughter, or a serious assault down to a lesser assault. If the belief wasn't even subjectively honest, well, then it's likely just murder or the original assault charge without mitigation.
Fantastic. That's a clear, actionable framework. Spot the issue. Test for perfect. Pivot if only objective reasonableness fails. Then check subjective honesty for imperfect. It's really a powerful look, isn't it, at how criminal law fundamentally prioritizes that mental state, the presence or absence of malice often above the physical act itself, even when the outcome is devastating.
It absolutely is, and it leaves us with a really interesting and maybe slightly unsettling final thought for you to consider. Remember, the court in Faulkner explicitly rejected the idea that ISD should be limited to extreme extenuating circumstances. Think about that. How far could the line of honest but unreasonable flair stretch in more common situations? Think about arguments escalating, perceived threats in everyday encounters. Where should the policy line ultimately be drawn between partial mitigation because of genuine subjective fear and holding someone fully accountable for an objectively unjustified act? That tension between subjective state and objectivity is a deep one, and it continues to challenge the law today.